to the interrelated topic of the economics of race. And to start our discussion off, we're delighted to have with us the Atlanta bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, Doug Blackman, who is the author of Slavery by Another Name, which is receiving fantastic attention throughout the country. We also are going to welcome here Helene Gayle, who is the former vice president of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and now is the president and CEO of CARE. And Mark Titus, a young businessman who is the new business director from Icon International. And it's my pleasure to turn this over to Doug Blackman.
Thank you so much for having me, and to the secretary, and Gail for inviting me. This is auspicious company for a fairly obscure writer like myself, and so it's great to be here. I also appreciate the kindness of some of the remarks about the book already, which has received a reception far outsized from the expectations I had for it, but which I think is a bit of a testament to many of the things that have been said already today about that we're in a moment in time in American life, I think, when there's a great hunger for a kind of unvarnished version of this history. And some of the photographs that you see scrolling on the screen above, these are images from out of the book, and there are many others like them on the website of the book, which is slaverybyanothername.com. But there is something very powerful about resurrecting both the graphic imagery of this period of time and these terrible events, and the prose of the book and the facts of the book are similar, I hope. One small thing, Mr. Secretary, you mentioned Colonel Dryden of the Tuskegee Airmen. Sadly to me, several weeks ago, I received a phone call from someone in Atlanta who told me that Colonel Dryden had received my book, and who I did not know him. And many of the events in the book occur near Tuskegee, Alabama. He had received the book and had been, sounds like self-flattery, but that he'd been moved by the book and badly wanted to meet me and have me sign his book. And so we were in the course of making the arrangements to do that when then I got a phone call that he had died. And I was a real tragedy, but an enormous compliment to the work. I also didn't know until today that Ron Walters was working on a parallel book. And had I known I was in a foot race with a giant like him, I would have abandoned the project years ago. But the Secretary asked me to talk about the economics of race. And the book is really a social history, but economics are a fundamental part of it, and that's part of what I think people have found very honest about the book is the way in which it plainly describes not just the fairly astonishing to most of us revelation that slavery, and by the way, when I talk about the slavery of the 20th century or the slavery after the Civil War, I'm really not talking about a kind of the inconvenienced life that most people associate for African Americans in that period of time, or just the tough life that existed then. I'm talking about slavery. I'm talking about large numbers of people who were bought and sold and through a commercial system, a highly evolved commercial system, and a conspiracy with the judicial system to not just to excessively punish people, but to force individuals who'd committed no crimes, had done nothing in their lives that would justify these events, who then would find themselves forced into a system of coerced labor and bought and sold, and a trafficking enterprise that surrounded that. And so I don't want anyone to think that this is just a story of the old stories of sharecropping, though that is a part of it. Another thing that the book gets at in terms of economically is that most of us have been taught, most of us, I suspect, in this room are still very much attached to the basic explanation for the economic divide between blacks and whites, asked that it all has to do with slavery, with old slavery, antebellum slavery. That's been the explanation we've always had. And as a white kid growing up in a little town in the Mississippi Delta, that was the explanation for why all the blacks in my town lived in this state of absolute poverty for the most part. And the explanation was, well, because of the end of slavery, blacks were uneducated and completely impoverished, and so this is the legacy of that. Well, in reality, if you just stop and think about that for a few minutes, it doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't make mathematical sense. It doesn't make economic sense. It's an irrational explanation. I mean, the reality is that almost no wealth in America today, and there obviously are some exceptions to this, but there are almost no corporations that exist today that existed prior to 1860. There are just a handful of them. There's almost no property in America that still is held in the hands of the same parties or the heirs to the people who owned that property in 1860. There's some, more so in the Northeast than in the South, but the idea that the economic conditions of America in 1865 somehow dictate the economic conditions of millions of individuals today really doesn't make much sense. And so, as I began to work on this book, one of the things that I was most moved by was that these are really the events, this slavery that resurrected itself at the end of the 19th century and continued and persisted and defeated efforts to stop it deep into the 20th century. These are the events that economically explain why things are the way they are today, far more so than antebellum slavery that we've been focused on always in the past. Jay Winik, when he was talking, described this incredibly powerful scene that he is also in his book, April 1865, that was an inspiring work for me. But the scene where Abraham Lincoln arrives in Richmond on a little boat immediately after the emancipation, and he's swarmed by freed slaves in this incredibly moving scene, which he described so movingly. Well, not far away from that location was a giant foundry, an iron foundry, called the Tredegar Iron Works. And the Tredegar Iron Works were the largest industrial enterprise in the South. It was the only foundry in the southern states that was capable of making cannon-grade iron and steel. It was the armaments manufacturing center for the Confederacy in the first 2 years of the Civil War, and it was occupied and worked almost entirely by slaves. There were 500 slaves who worked at the Tredegar Iron Works. And they made all of the cannon, all of the metal plating on the outsides of the Confederate ships, most of the gun barrel steel. The industrial capacity of the South at the beginning of the Civil War was completely invested in this huge slave factory operation in Richmond, Virginia. Well, that was one aspect of a phenomenon that was beginning in the South just before the Civil War that few historians have focused much attention on, and that was a great experiment that was occurring in various places among Southern capitalists with industrial slavery. And that's a critical aspect of understanding what happened after the Civil War. But particularly in Virginia and in Alabama, where you also had big deposits of coal and iron, there were capitalists who had begun to challenge the old idea that slaves weren't capable of this kind of complex industrial work. And of course they were. And so in the 1850s, you had many, many capitalists, almost all forgotten into obscurity today, but who were experimenting with using slaves in foundries and sawmills and early factories, turpentine production, stills, a whole range of things which previously had been viewed not that slaves were not capable of doing. That started a pattern that, and also one other note on that, you heard from Katrina Brown earlier about her documentary, Traces of the Trade, which is a fabulous work. And part of what's fabulous about it is that it captures the degree to which that at the beginning of the Civil War, the degree to which that the slave economy was not merely a Southern thing. And in fact, the national economy was so rooted in this foundation of slavery, this addiction to forced labor. It particularly was the case in the South, obviously, and that, again, most of us have grown up in a mythology that describes slavery as this thing that involved white people with plantations and black people who mysteriously appeared there from Africa. And maybe we know something about the Atlantic Passage, but we have no comprehension of the things that her documentary shows so powerfully, which is this enormous economic system that went along with slavery. There were thousands and thousands of people who didn't own slaves, but made their livelihood and their lives and all of their wealth were based in this economy of slavery. There were the people who bought slaves at the docks. There were wholesalers who moved around the country and delivered slaves to subsidiary markets in other parts of the country. There were slave retailers who traveled the back roads with traces of slaves behind them, going door to door, offering slaves to plantation owners. There were doctors. There were Negro breeders. There were plantations that existed purely for the purpose of raising slaves, which is a horrible, dark aspect of slavery that's been very little examined. But slavery was so fundamental to the American economy that I compare it to, if we tried to imagine today that suddenly you removed from the American economy the internal combustion engine, and what would happen in the wake of that. It wouldn't be just that cars would stop operating. The ripple effects of removing that powerful engine of the economy in one stroke would be absolutely catastrophic. And that's what happened at the end of the Civil War. And particularly in the South, whites were helpless, frankly. And I'm not saying that just because it's fun to beat up on whites, but it's a reality that at the end of the Civil War, white farmers in particular and these capitalists who had begun to amass great fortunes using slaves in industrial settings were helpless without forced labor. And so immediately after the Civil War, there is this period of time during Reconstruction and actually lasting a fair time beyond it, in which there's authentic freedom for the 4 million freed slaves and the first generation who were born to them. And there were millions of slaves, ex-slaves, who separated from the white people who had controlled their lives. They had difficult lives. They had little education. The circumstances of their life was incredibly difficult by our standards, but there was authentic freedom, and there was massive participation in the political process. There were huge numbers of people who owned or took possession of farms and lived independent lives. And that period of real freedom continued for large numbers of African Americans for 20 or 25 years after the Civil War, which makes what happened after that so powerfully horrifying, that this window into authentic freedom and economic opportunity existed and then was brutally taken away. And that's much of what my book is about, how this new system of slavery was brought back into place, driven by, in the beginning, the industrialists who had discovered how successfully slaves could be used in industrial operations prior to the Civil War. And so what begins to happen after the Civil War, and that I write through in the book, or in the 1880s and the 1890s, is that all of the southern states began to pass this grid of laws which effectively criminalize black life. It becomes virtually impossible for an African-American man anywhere in the South, and up until 1910, almost all African-Americans remained in the South, vast majority of them. It becomes impossible for any African-American man to live, or woman, though the nexus of this, or the focal point of this are black men. It's impossible for them to live with any sense of true security unless it is under the overt control and protection of some white man. And obviously there are exceptions to all of this, and there are heroic figures who defied these terrible practices, and there were, in some urban areas of the South, there were places where vibrant, much more independent black communities were able to defeat this. But the reality, the overwhelming reality that this was the central experience of African Americans in this period of time was the return of this horrifyingly coercive and abusive system, and so the laws that were passed were that it became illegal for a man, and of course none of these laws said they applied only to African Americans, but overwhelmingly they were only enforced against African Americans. And so it was a crime if you couldn't prove at any given moment that you had a job. The vagrancy statutes came into powerful force for the first time in this period. The first laws against carrying a weapon were passed in this period of time, and were enforced overwhelmingly against African-American men. It was a crime in every southern state for a farm worker to leave the employment of one landowner to go and become employed by a different landowner without permission from the first landowner. That was a crime in the South. And of course, it was only enforced against African Americans, or for the most part. This whole grid of laws, including the laws which defined the interaction between whites and blacks. And there were thousands and thousands of African American men who were arrested over this period of time for things like talking loudly in the company of white women, or they would be charged with disorderly conduct, or a whole range of these kinds of crimes which were purely a sort of social control for the racial order that was being placed upon African Americans then. And all of this was hand in glove with the political exclusion and the violence and other forms of intimidation that were happening in the same period of time. By 1900, the judicial system of the South has been completely reconfigured in a way that where one of its primary purposes, aside from punishment of people who've actually committed crimes, is to provide labor to these enterprises in the South who were participating in the system of leasing, which effectively meant buying prisoners from every state government and thousands of county governments all across the South. And this is something that historians have acknowledged in the conventional history as a kind of sideline to what was happening during this period of time. But the reality is that it's been grossly minimized. And there's a huge body of evidence out there that's never been very closely examined, except now it's beginning to be, and Ron Walters is working on another huge trove of material out there. But the reality was that over an 80-year period of time, a 70 or 80-year period of time, hundreds of thousands of African Americans. In Alabama, I can very precisely document at least 200,000 African Americans who were forced into coerced labor through this judicial process, and the vast majority of them, the evidence is overwhelming that they were convicted on crimes on either just completely trivial or trumped-up offenses, or under laws that were later declared unconstitutional, like all of the ones that I was describing just a minute ago. So it was clearly a system of a process of using the legal system to coerce African Americans into forced labor. And once you begin to have this system in which thousands of people are disappearing into these forced labor camps, and there were hundreds of them all over the South, once you have thousands and thousands of African American men being forced into this situation, this is the hammer that hangs over the lives, even more so than lynchings, I would argue. More because the racial violence of the period happened much less frequently and was obviously something that every black family was aware of and taught their children how to accommodate somehow into their lives. But the threat of being forced back into this de facto slavery, what I call neo-slavery, was something that hung over the head of every black man, every black woman in the South. And it happened to thousands and thousands of people, and this is one of the reasons why, at the same time, millions of other African Americans, this is how they were compelled into this life of servitude, of docile servitude in the rural areas of the South. And so sharecropping and farm tenancy and the neo-slavery that I talk about are all facets of the same phenomenon. And that's something that I think historians have been remiss in acknowledging in the past. So the economic impact of all of that. In 1865, there were 4 million slaves who were freed at the end of the war. And by 1910, we'll jump forward to that. By 1910, there are 10.2 million African Americans, almost all of whom live in a state of poverty and quasi-illiteracy in the South. Well, that we know fundamentally. But what we forget is that there were also an equal number of whites in the exact same economic condition at the same point in time. But what had begun to happen in the 1890s and continuing in the first decades of the 20th century were two great social phenomena that changed the equation. One was what I was just describing, this rise of neo-slavery that affected millions of blacks. But at the same time, it didn't have a name. It wasn't called the New Deal. It wasn't called the War on Poverty. But at the same time, the federal government and many state governments had for the first time begun to take on for themselves a mission of that a primary purpose of government was a kind of economic uplift of terribly impoverished citizens. And so there was actually a great campaign to change the economic and social conditions of these incredibly poor Southerners, but only the white ones. And so where the infrastructure was built in the South, where roads were put, which bridges were rebuilt after the spring rains every year, which defined who was going to be able to get their cotton to the gin and who wouldn't be able to get their cotton to the gin, all of these decisions, and the construction of schools. And in fact, until the 1890s, amazingly, in places like Alabama and most of the South, the segregated school system, in fact, was separate and it was equal. There actually was equal funding for black schools in many, many places in the South for 25 years after the end of the Civil War, even after the end of Reconstruction. And yet, but when we get to this period of time in the 1890s, when this great campaign of uplift, very purposefully orchestrated by the state governments and the federal government begins, it's all reserved for whites. And many of the resources which had been going to blacks, such as for these equally funded public schools, begin to be robbed from the black schools and funneled into the white schools. And the impact of all that is that by the time you get to 1910, 1920, millions and millions of poor white families have emerged from abject poverty into lower class or lower middle class status, own property, own farms, and where 3/4 of all the farms in the South are owned by whites, or 3/4 of whites who farm in the South own their land. Blacks, on the other hand, a fraction, a tiny fraction of African Americans actually own the land that they farm. And it's difficult to pin down exactly how many people were forced into this system, but the reality is that millions and millions of African Americans' lives and ability to accumulate wealth in the ways that were available to whites were terribly, terribly circumscribed. The one last thing on this is sort of how this came to an end, and just a very brief version of this is that this process continued all the way up to the beginning of World War II. One of the reasons for that was because through that whole period of time, slavery was not a crime. That's a hard thing to just hold that thought for a moment. But slavery had been abolished by the 13th Amendment. But one of the things that various people who tried to attack this system discovered at the very beginning of the 20th century was that the Congress had never passed a criminal statute making it a crime to hold slaves. And all of those laws which could have been used against the slaveholders, such as kidnapping, were state laws, and no southern state would prosecute those laws in those circumstances. And so through this 80-year period of time, there is no law on which to prosecute any person for holding slaves. And it becomes the policy of the Department of Justice not to investigate allegations of slavery. And that doesn't change until December of 1941, 5 days after Pearl Harbor, after President Roosevelt has convened his cabinet and the great mobilization of the government has begun to fight World War II, and there's a discussion about propaganda problems. And it's raised with the president that America is going to have trouble arguing that it is the force fighting for freedom based on the treatment of Negroes in the South, and that the Japanese would begin to attack through their propaganda. And because of that, 5 days later, the Attorney General of the United States sends a memo out to all the U.S. attorneys saying, it's been our policy not to prosecute these cases. From this point forward, prosecute them. And a few months later, the first serious prosecution of a white person for holding slaves in the United States occurs, and the next year they're convicted in Corpus Christi, Texas. So.
Well done.
Just a quick word. Janet gave me Doug's book. She caught him, I think, on C-SPAN, but she went out and got this book and said, you got to read this. Number one, I was surprised. Number one, I thought it said black man. It must be a black man. And so I was surprised to find that you were white. The second surprise was I found that you were the Wall Street Journal. And the third one, of course, is that you wrote with such great wisdom and insight in this. This is a brilliant book. And it does prove the lie that we've lived for so long, that it was only confined for a small period, that slavery was abolished, that went through a bad period. But you have proven that the rest of the country has really profited on the backs of people who were put into slavery, even though it had been abolished. It's a fabulous book, and thank you very much for having written it.
Thank you very much.
A more personal note, on behalf of my ancestors and my grandparents in particular who lived that period, thank you. Thank you very much for writing it.
Well, thank you, and I'll say one other thing on that. Over the last few months, as I've been out talking about the book, I have been amazed again and again when I've made presentations and then had responses from readers, or in the hundreds and hundreds of emails that have come in, how often it is that an African-American person will say to me, you know, I heard about you, I read the book, and now I finally understand that crazy story that my grandmother would tell, or that my great-grandmother would tell. And, you know, and I would say to her, no, you know, Mama, you know, it's not possible that you were a slave when you're talking about, because you weren't born until 1930, and you're describing the 1950s, and, you know, that's not possible. And now she's dead. And so one of the things I've learned is that every African-American family has a story that belongs in this sequence of events, and that's a powerful and moving thing. And one of the things I'm proudest of about the book is trying to resurrect those voices and the humanity of those victims. And so the main character of this book is a completely anonymous and by every standard inconsequential person, but who died under horrible circumstances working as a slave in 1908. And much of what I tried to do in the book was to resurrect the life and the memory of this person in some way, and in a way that where I would try to draw lessons from what we've learned about memory in the context of the Holocaust. And this is not to try to compare these terrible social crimes, but what we have learned from the Holocaust is the importance, the absolute imperative of recognizing the humanity of these victims, even though because they were illiterate oftentimes, and because they weren't in a position to write memoirs or to write thousands of letters documenting what was happening to them as these terrible events occurred, that we have some obligation today, I think, to try to resurrect that past and honor that. And it's only through that kind of an accounting, like so many people are talking about today, that I think we can really come to terms with the enormity of what really happened and move from there.
I may have missed it because I was late coming in. One, why did you write the book? And then what do white people say about it?
Well, in terms of white people, I've been impressed with white people, surprisingly. More of them have liked it than I expected. And people ask me how my hometown has reacted, and I explained to them that my hometown sort of stopped liking me a long time ago for other reasons, but for other things that I've written. And my next book is about my hometown. But the reason I wrote the book or the reason that I have been moved by these questions, these issues all of my life really, is that in the beginning I did grow up in this very tumultuous circumstance. The earlier observation that anyone over 55 is a first at something if you're African American. Well, in my case, any white kid who grew up attempting to stay a part of the public life in a little town in Mississippi in the 1960s and 70s is a first at something or an only at something. And I was the only white kid in a lot of situations for a long, long time. But I grew up in this little place in the Mississippi Delta where I was born in September of 1964, so just after Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were murdered. In 1965, there was a farm labor strike on the outside of town that was the first organized farm labor action in the South since the 1930s. That led to great violence and unrest. In 1968, black high school students in my town protested segregation of the schools and were tear gassed by the local police. And then in 1970, I began the first grade in the first class of children in Mississippi to begin the first grade together, black and white, and to go through 12 full grades of integrated education. And so from very early on, I was confused by why things were the way they were, why there was all this hostility, why black kids were mad at me for reasons I couldn't figure out, why the white kids I went to church with were mad at me who didn't go to school with me were angry. And so all my life I've been pursuing these explanations, and the book is finally something of a culmination of that.
Thank you.
Helene Gale, we're going to ask you to present, and I know that you have to take a break for just a moment. So do you want to say a few words, and then you will come back and continue?
Yeah, thank you. And just want to also just add my thanks to Bill and Janet Cohen, but also to the Gilman Foundation for this convening. Just to start out, I would just say this is has been an incredible experience for me already. I think just having this room and such a range of people with such incredible experiences to bear on this is really unique, and I hope that, and I'll kind of start where I'm going to leave off, which is, I think this is just a beginning, and I hope that this is just a beginning because it's an incredible dialogue, but we also have to have other people in the room. We also have to think about what actions we want to take. So again, I just think this is fabulous. Economics of race. I'm not an economist. I haven't written a book on this topic. I spend most of my time these days working globally, focusing on the issues of global poverty, but I speak from the perspective of somebody who does work globally, also somebody who's a public health physician and has seen the economics of race play out in health here in America, and I guess also from being an African-American woman living here for the last 50-plus years on this earth. So I guess it's with all those different perspectives that I think about this issue, and I won't go into a lot of detail that Doug covered, I think, very nicely about what the economics have been and what the costs have been. I think while we recognize that race is an incredibly complicated issue and racism and all the roots to it are incredibly complicated, economics has been a part of it from the very beginning. We know that slavery in many ways was founded on a basis of economics. What this country has gained as a result of the cheap, very cheap labor, free labor that came with slavery. But I think the flip side of that is what the economic costs have been. And I think that's what we're starting to bear, and that's what we're starting to recognize, is that you don't get away with an institution like slavery, the complex consequences of racism, without paying for them. And I think people have talked about these in so many ways, but I think there are two aspects of it. One, just the sheer reality that we're paying for these. We are paying for this in a variety of ways. We talked about education. I think people brought out points very clearly why it's costing us in terms of the lack of equitable education for our youth and what the consequences are for that. Again, as a health professional, I have seen time and time again what the health costs have been and what that has done. But I think in whatever arena we want to talk about, racism has cost us and is costing us as a country, and I think is going to continue to have an economic cost. I think the other cost, and the one that I see not only here, but also as I go around the world and look at what it means to leave human potential on the cutting room floor, is that I think we're paying for it in the missed opportunities and the lack of potential for every human being, and the fact that we don't know if that young boy or girl who somebody may write off is the person who will discover the cure for cancer, or who might be the person who could be the next leader of this country. And so I think it's the loss of human potential that in some ways is the most tragic aspect and has some of the greatest economic cost. Again, from an economic
We're going to cut you off because he wants you to have a wider audience. CNN wants to interview her outside, so we're going to cut her off now so you can go do the interview and come back.
Oh, okay, all right,
Yes.
okay, all right,
Yes.
all right, good.
Yes. And when she returns, this is merely bookmarked, Helene. You'll be back and continue as soon as you're back. And in the interim, it's a pleasure to introduce Mark Titus.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First thing I wanted to do is start off by thanking Secretary Mrs. Cohen for having me here, and the Gilman Foundation for putting on such a wonderful conference. The dialogue and the resulting dialogues from this one are going to be invaluable to us all in understanding what we have to do to mend the divide that we have in this country, not only socially, but as we're going to discuss here, economically. Where can I start? Well, I'm going to try to keep this within the time constraints because obviously it's a very complex issue wrapped around another very complex issue. I'm a small town guy from Connecticut, and I come from humble beginnings in another country with my family, and from where we began, once we set foot here, it was basically starting over again. We gave up everything we had in Jamaica, my home country, and came here to start over and hopefully find a way to get some stability again. And more or less, that puts me in a situation of being almost an objective party when it comes to watching what happens around you in a country that has this sort of an issue really festering and going on. It's hard to be objective, really, when you're a person of color. It makes it a little more complicated to do, but just bear with me. If you're able to take a step back and get outside yourself for a second and just look at what's going on, it was a study. This was an education. And now I'm going to kind of share some of the things that I've seen. I'm not an economic whiz. I'm not a numbers person. I work for a company that provides a financial benefit to companies who need to rescue an asset. So this will kind of give you an understanding of how I conceived of, what we need to do to maybe mend some of this divide. I'm paid to survey other corporations to understand their problems, and from there, formulate a plan of action and lay the groundwork for my company to provide the solution. And I do that aggressively, and I like to think I do it well. So taking taking some of my cues from what I do for a living, I've been able to apply some of that to my family. And hopefully down the road to my community, which I've begun to do by working with the Obama campaign. And I never thought I'd be in a situation where my family would look to me for economic plans of action when, you know, we basically started from zero, and I'm the youngest of 6. All right, some of that groundwork was already laid, so it's hard for me to step up and be the person kind of leading some of the thoughts. How are we going to pay for this? How are we going to pay for special care? How are we going to pay for dad in the senior home? All these things, and people are looking to me for answers. I guess because I'm so accustomed to doing that all day long, 5 days a week. So I wanted to take what I did and coming up with some of those thoughts for my family, and then now turn it back outward. How can I share this with the community? How can I share this with the country? Are there people out there that have similar thoughts and ideas? And obviously, from looking at this room, there are. It's a complex issue, what we're talking about here, and I think there are three pillars of this dialogue that we have to move forward on. And you know, to start off, I'd say the first thing that I'd like to touch on is responsibility. Taking responsibility for your own financial, economic development, stability, it starts there. It can't start from the family unit. It really can't. It can't start from your local government, your federal government. It can't. It has to start with you. You have to outline what it would take for you to be comfortable financially, for you to be successful financially. All of that starts with your expectations for yourself. And if there was any one thing I could teach my future children, my nephews, my nieces, whenever they're looking at their piggy bank and wondering what to spend it on, just before I take the piggy bank away from them, I tell them to think about what's inside that piggy bank that's going to make you happy. Is it the money? No. It's what you aspire to do with that money. It's what you're going to buy with that money that may give you the tools you need to find some level of comfort in this country and what you're doing. And I think that's where it all starts. You take responsibility for what you're going to look for that's going to make you, that's going to enable you to get what you need in this country. And the second point is education, which I'm thrilled to death to be going after, for this session here, to be going just after the education session. I thought that was well thought out because the two are so closely tied to each other. And what I've seen growing up, I've seen the way education provides you with the groundwork that you need to understand the landscape that you're looking at when you're talking about your career, your savings, your investment, all that you need a good understanding based in education of how you're going to apply what you've got as in terms of your assets and your money and your wealth. And that starts not only obviously in school, but as Sergeant Michael said, it also starts at the dinner table, starts at home. It starts when one relative turns to another relative, you know, younger person, and explains to them the importance of that fingerprint that they lay down when they start to create a credit history for themselves. That interest rate on your savings account, what that all means, what that does for you in your future, how that impacts you and those around you, how it impacts when you become married and you don't really want to bring a negative credit history to a marriage, obviously. These sorts of things are important things to think about when you're talking to the younger people. And so the education part of it is just enormous. The third part of this whole equation, I think, is, and from what I've seen, is the purpose. Going forward, what's your plan of action? How are you going to execute? What are you going to do with your money? Is it going to gratify something in the short term, the long term, all of those things? It's the purpose. You can't allow a child to remain idle when you're discussing money with them. There's a program in my small town in Connecticut called Action, Community Action. It was headed up by a man named Bill Curtis. Bill was like everyone's surrogate father. Really, really nice guy. I think a retired jazz musician as well, a drummer. And this program seemed like the only place that a lot of us out of school in a black community in my town could get an early start with a job. They would allow us to work at a really early age. And, and it would obviously be community-based things, stopping by and delivering mail to the senior care facilities and things like that. And all of the money that we made, a lot of times you see guys come back to the office to collect their checks, and Bill would be like, not so quickly. What are you going to do with it? Just kidding with us. And it made you think for a second. And that conditioning wore in. After, just towards the end of the summer when the program would be coming to an end, every single time you'd expect him to ask what you're going to do with your newfound wealth there. And I think that's something that definitely tells me what I need to do as far as educating, the younger people that come after me about their earnings and their economics. So between responsibility for what you want to achieve, the education of what the instrument you're holding in your hand when you hold a dollar bill, and with purpose, what you plan to do with that. I think those three things are the foundation for, a more stable economic future for people of color. And just on a final note, was really interesting was seeing that, you could actually overlay this with a story actually I thought of just on the way here. There was a kid in our neighborhood. His name was Rodney Brown. And it seemed like whatever you could want as a child, especially a child of color, Rodney had it. Right? He had the cars, his father and mother owned a home, he got the allowance, he had, the newest BMX bike, he had all those things that everybody were like, wow, Rodney has everything. What is the deal with this guy? And we saw that it was rooted in the fact that he had a really stable family unit. And his dad saw to it that when it was time to go home and get some sleep or do his homework, whatever, Rodney did it. When it was time to do his chores to earn his allowance, Rodney was there mowing the lawn. Never failed, never failed. And it just showed me the tie between your family and your upbringing and that nurturing environment and how you can achieve things. And to me, that translates into your financial prosperity and the importance of the family unit and starting the ball rolling. But it always seemed that, I didn't know whether it was nurture or nature with Rodney or whether he decided to, take ultimate responsibility for his well-being, but he's a success now, obviously. He's done what he had to do. He respected his family's wishes. He learned what he had to learn, and he's achieved great things. And, all of these things that I discussed earlier, the education, responsibility, purpose, were infused in him. And, if you've got a relatively good kid, which most kids start off as being, no kid starts off a bad kid. They're going to want to do what's right and what's healthy and what feels good. And if you show them the path to doing that, I'm sure there's some way they could come up with a way to find economic stability for themselves and comfort for themselves. And that's all I wanted to say about that.
We will now open the floor to comment. I did want to say, by the way, that since we began, we did want to welcome 2 additional guests to our conference, Deepak Chopra and the former NATO commander and commandant of the Marine Corps, Jim Jones. So welcome to our table. Dr. Christopher, why don't we start with you and then Mr. Wenger and Beverly.
Well, like everyone else, I have to express my heartfelt appreciation to Janet and Secretary Cohen, Mrs. Cohen, for having the courage to convene us and for creating an environment of such honesty. I have experienced the conversation today on many levels. I was moved to tears on many occasions. But I must say that what I am feeling right now is a tremendous sense of pride and respect for African Americans. what we have endured in this country and what we have achieved in spite of that is immeasurable. And when we talk about truth and reconciliation, or truth repair and reconciliation, as a vice president of a major foundation that has committed to being an anti-racist organization and to launching a major initiative in this country toward racial equity, I have struggled with, what does truth mean here in this country? Does it really mean going back and revisiting all of the pain? Or does it perhaps have a different meaning for us today, given that there have been so many centuries of oppression? And the thought that I'm left with right now, which I wanted to share, and it speaks to economic possibility. I'm a divorced single mother of 2 wonderful children who have achieved great things. And I've often asked myself, why? What did they have? What was I able to give them? And I was able to share with them a core philosophy that I think is critical part of the truth that we as African Americans must embrace. And that truth is that they are not what this country says they are. That they are the embodiment of divine intelligence, of divine love, and divine capability. And that means that they have access to all that there is if they can imagine it and they can achieve it. And that's been embedded into really into their DNA. And I believe that a piece of the work for African Americans, for all, as that young man illustrated so beautifully this morning, we have somehow got to embed into the consciousness of every person of color in this country who they really are, who we really are. Our nation is in denial, and your wonderful book will help us to get past that. We deny the fact of oppression and slavery. We certainly deny the consequences, which is the next phase of denial. We also deny the implications. But most importantly, we deny the feelings. And those feelings, which either immobilize us or propel us, have got to be grappled with. And that's an important part of this work. Because what we feel essentially is what we are. It's what moves us or keeps us from moving. And so this is a tremendous work that we must begin again, as it were, and we will have to compel resources to support this work. It is in the classroom, it is in the homes, it is in the institutions, it's in the jails, it's in the hospitals, because racism is everywhere. So this work is comprehensive in nature, but I believe that our next president, no matter who that is, requires a cadre of folks like us, and each of us multiplied 100,000 times over, to in fact demand that this country, once and for all, address this painful divide, which actually has the potential to destroy us as a nation.
Michael, I'm going to ask you to go next, followed by Beverly, and I do want to also say we're going to call on Bernard Bergreen of the Gilman Foundation and also Jason Dean.
Thank you. I want to follow up a little bit on what Gail said, and I too, of course, want to thank Bill and Janet Cohen and Doug Wilson for convening this important event. I also want to recognize Peggy McIntosh, whose work informs in an incredibly deep way the class on race relations that I teach at George Washington University. It never fails that that is the most profound piece of work that they experience during the semester. And I simply want to acknowledge that publicly. I also want to tell a very brief story that goes to what Janet said earlier about you have to be carefully taught, and goes to a question Maria had earlier about how you teach your children. I was married to an African-American woman and I have 3 African American children and 4 grandchildren. And I'm now married to a white woman. And my wife, when my oldest granddaughter, who is now 15, was about 4 or 5 years old, my current wife would pick her up from school every day. And one day, they were standing, she and her little friends were standing outside, and my wife drove up. And one of Ariane's little friends said to her, "Is that your mother?" And Ariane, with all of the indignation that a 5-year-old could possibly muster, said, "No, silly, she's white. She's my grandmother." And I simply tell you that story to say that at 5 years old, the color of one's skin had about as much meaning to her as the color of a Crayola crayon. So you do have to be carefully taught, and we need to keep that in mind. I want to bookend my brief remarks around 2 comments that my friend Chris Edley, that I've heard him say many times in the past, that I think are worth repeating. First, that dealing with the issue of race is not rocket science. It's a lot harder than rocket science. And we found this out. I had the honor to work with President Clinton's initiative on race and actually flew on Secretary Cohen's plane one day to a speech that you gave. And one of the frustrations that we had with the initiative on race was that we found ourselves preaching to the choir. I think we were fairly successful in preaching to the choir and very frustrated about not being able to get beyond the choir. And one of the reasons that I think this gathering is so important is that people like Secretary Cohen and Mrs. Cohen have a reach that is beyond the reach that most of us generally are able to have. And so the question that arises here is something that Gail just talked about, is how do we take advantage of this gathering? How do we create a movement for the kind of change that Gail just talked about that is so desperately needed in this country? How do we create a movement that changes the content of the curriculum in schools? How do we create a movement that changes the content of American history textbooks so that the history that children learn is accurate and complete? How do we create a national dialogue so that everybody can share their stories and everybody has a story? How do we create a movement that pressures for policy changes like the sentencing disparities that fill our prisons? How do we create a movement that revolutionizes teacher training? How do we create a movement that allows us to talk about racism as a part of poverty? We see people talking about poverty today, and somehow the issue of racism is buried in the discussion of poverty. So I guess my question is, or my plea is, that we have a summary of these proceedings, that we have some time during this convening to talk about actual action steps that we can take, and that there is follow-up so that we can implement those action steps. And I conclude with another comment that Chris Edley made once that I've always remembered, and that is, we have to create an army of soldiers for justice. And if this can be the beginning of that, more power to us.
Oh, well. Michael, thank you. Thank you so much for giving us the agenda for action. And I had anticipated that when Bill and I, along with the Gilman Foundation, came up with this concept of race and reconciliation. And my Rabbi Shmuel Hertzfeld, and he is my holy spark. I don't know how many of you remember Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He was my mentor's mentor. He was Dr. King's mentor. And he said, look for the holy sparks. And the rabbi is my holy spark, along with his mentor, Rabbi Weiss. And we had talked about what we would do after. What is the after action of this? And I decided what I would do is I want to go and meet with the elders at Century Village in Florida and share the memory of our two peoples and how we've struggled for justice. I also want to go, after looking at the primaries and the fallout and saying there's certain states that I or Obama are not welcome in. I want to go to West Virginia, and I'd like somebody to invite me. I think it's much more polite to go when you're invited. Will you do that? I want to speak to like-minded Americans because we mustn't presume that a certain group of people are all this. I believe there's some great West Virginians, and I have met a few when I was in Winchester. So I'd like an invitation to visit a church, to talk to them, to share with them, maybe take Douglas Blackman with me and his book, and that is my after action for this conference. Maybe you, as I believe Gail said, racism sadly is so ubiquitous, we can find it everywhere, beginning in our own minds, in our own families, in our communities. So you don't have to come to this conference to do something about racism. But Michael, thank you for bringing that up so I'd have a chance to share that.
And with all due respect to General Jones, the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the Army of the Soldiers for Justice is Janet Cohen.
Soldiers for Justice, I like that.
Beverly, Bernard, Josh, and Jason, if you will permit me, I think it's only fair just to be able to return the mic to Helene Gale so that she can finish her presentation. And so if that's all right, Helene.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks. And I'm going to be very, very brief because I think it's as exciting to hear what everybody else has to say. And so let me just make a few points pretty quickly. First of all, as I mentioned, I spend a lot of my time now focusing on global issues. And I think from a global perspective, clearly this is an issue that is broader than the United States, but what the United States does matters. And I think Chris Edley made that point earlier. You know, everywhere that I go, it is amazing how universal this need to have other and to make distinctions. And I think it has to do with fear. It has to do with a sense of competition, a sense of lack, and thinking about scarcity and some of the things that are at the core of this. But I think our ability to show that we can get past this and that we can think more broadly, I think will have a huge impact on the rest of the world, whether it's, you know, crises in Darfur, you know, whether it's the Middle East. You know, I think there are a lot of, you can go around the world and look at the kind of conflicts that people have that are built on a notion of differences. And I think the more that we can show, as many people have said, our common humanity and how much we have in common and how we as a country that is known around the world for having not dealt with this issue, if we can do it, then I think we can be a beacon of hope to the rest of the world. So I think we have a real leadership role that goes beyond us in this country that can help in healing the world in general. We've talked about this issue of economics, I think, in a variety of ways. And as I was starting to say, I think, you know, the worst part of it is the cost of racism long term, but also the cost of wasted potential and what that does. And I think we have to think about that and how do we make sure that ultimately we're doing what we can to make sure that everybody has the ability to recognize their full potential. Because again, I think that's when we in this country, as well as the rest of the world, will be able to have a very different world when we have one that allows people to each reach their full potential. So, it's been said many, many, many times over the course of these last few hours, the role that history plays and how we are really captive to our lack of knowledge and our lack of understanding of history. And I think our lack of understanding of history means that, as many have said, our ability to find the right solutions is hampered. Our solution is not commensurate with the issue because we don't have a full understanding of that. Until we do, I think we're not going to be able to move forward and we'll continue to be hindered by it. And I think, you know, finally, we're also hindered by a lack of vision. I think we have gotten stuck in terms of what we expect of ourselves and what we expect is possible. And I think somebody said it earlier this morning, that our sense of our our vision of limit, I think, really imposes on us, continues to impose on us this need to have things that divide us versus thinking about what are the things that we have that can move us forward in a much broader vision where there's much greater possibility than we've allowed ourselves to believe. And so part of what I think today can be is one that creates a vision that's very different, that creates a vision that really believes that we can get beyond some of these things and that we can create a world that has a greater sense of recognizing our common humanity and how much we have, how much all of us have to gain if we can get past this and not continue to be vested in our own sense of differentness and hold on to that. I think we honestly often don't believe that we can be better. I think we often don't believe that we can be bigger than this. And I think it's in creating that vision that we can. And finally, as I started out when I started out before saying is that I think that this dialogue is fabulous, and I think we'll all leave here. I know I'll leave here with different thoughts than I came into this room with. It will make a difference in the way that I behave as an individual, but I think that's not good enough. And I think that we have to think about how do we move this forward in a way that really creates a movement for change in this area. And I think if we believe that we can be better and that we believe that we can be different, we can create a movement. And I think for a lot of reasons, we're at a point in time, and everybody's talked about the different historical moments, the 40 years, the 45 years, the 60 years, and what we've achieved. But I think if we can really set a marker, set a real vision, and believe that we're part of creating a social movement, I think now is the time, and I think we have some opportunities that we've never had before. So I just want to say, I'm very pleased to be part of this dialogue. I think it does matter. It matters not only for us, but I think it matters for the rest of the world. So thank you.
To Don Moore and to Jerry Talbot and to Bruce Jacobs, I promise you guys have claim on the first comments for the next session. We've got to finish with our final four, and then we will turn to the media and film, and you all have first comments at that point. So, Beverly.
I have the privilege of working at the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket. And one of the pieces of history that we've taken a look at is these kinds of meetings. Anti-slavery meetings, not only in Boston, and groups of African Americans getting together around the country. We've also looked at African Americans meeting in the free black community in the Northeast. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin said that it's important to get together with like-minded people to have a good conversation among ourselves. First of all, to kind of gird us for the work that's ahead, but also as a learning and teaching moment. When these folks got together, and we've done a lot of research recently, first of all, they thanked the folks who brought them together and continued to thank them because it took a lot of personal will and vision and empowering of people to give them the opportunity to sit together in a space where they could feel free to talk. These folks got together on issues of colonization and the education of African Americans as early as the same night as the Boston Tea Party, where they were meeting, African Americans were meeting, talking about how they were going to get free from the people who were trying to get free from the British. Same night. So the fact that we don't know not only this X-rated history of tremendous violence, but we also do not know the history of these ordinary and extraordinary African Americans who lived very, in some cases, mundane lives as bootblacks or servants, coming together in 1798 to form a school on Beacon Hill called the African School. 66 black people, after petitioning for schools for children, led by Prince Hall, said that they should lay aside their superfluities to start a school of their own, and they did it in someone's home. When we teach this history to children, they first want to know, why didn't we know this? I mean, we don't know anybody stood up for us, that anybody resisted, that they actually created a school in 1798, that they built buildings and resources and a history that is extremely important. Clearly, this X-rated history is not one that we can teach to children in the same way, but we need to teach them these heroic stories because, frankly, it's not only myth, but it's the lies that they are being taught about the economics of this country. Slavery was the main event, and it was powering the economy. Cotton, by the Civil War, whether or not it was being cultivated by African Americans or woven into garments, was powering the economy. And then to say that African Americans were ignorant, incapable, invalid, invalid, invisible in some way, docile yet needing to be chained, go figure, it is a very crazy story. So partly for children of all children, they need to know these stories, these powerful stories. Right now, we're working on some research and an exhibit on Black entrepreneurs of the 18th and 19th centuries. I'll say that again, of the 18th and 19th centuries. And when we talk to people, they don't even know what we mean. Somehow those words associated with Black people in the 1700s and 1800s, Black people were doing what? I mean, that would mean they had money or they invested, they had a business plan, they had clients. There is so much to be learned, so much to be researched, so much to be shared about people who had iron factories and all kinds of work that they did to be shared with our children. I do think we need to rewrite the textbooks. We can tell all of American history through a new prism and put it online where it's much more available.
Thank you, Beverly.
For our final three speakers, I would ask that you keep your remarks brief because we have a couple of speakers at the next panel whose schedules are relatively tight. So if I can turn first to Bernard Bergreen, then to Josh Packwood, and the last word goes to Jason Dean.
Congratulations to Janet.
You need a mic. If you're going to congratulate us, you need a mic.
And also to Doug. Just a few observations. I was surprised that with the pessimism that I heard this morning, to a lesser extent this afternoon, that here we're living in a revolutionary period. We have someone who's African American who's probably going to be elected president. And that in and of itself is indicative of how far things have gone and progressed in this country. And the fact that it hasn't been touched upon and its significance hasn't been somehow magnified here is very surprising to me. The other thing is that a lot has been said, what can we do to bring change along? And actually, there's another revolutionary thing going on in the world, and that is suddenly there's the opening of India and China. And these are not Caucasian races. These are Asians and Indians and so forth, and a lot of other different Asiatic countries in that area. So the question of race is not only black and white, it's manifold. And so that when we talk about racial conflict, so forth, you have to take into account that there's going to be a great minimization of the white compared to the colored people in the world, which there is right now. Thirdly, they're predicting even in our own country, by the year 2050, that the white race will be a minority race, so that there are things going on which I thought would have been touched upon, which are demographic and are going to have enormous impact on what's going to happen in this country in terms of elections, in terms of education, in terms of change and so forth. And we can see it going on all the time. The other thing, of course, is another revolution is the technological revolution, and that is with kids growing up today and having access to the internet and so forth. And I think that hasn't been touched upon. The black youth today has access to things which others didn't have. And this is true also of poverty-stricken areas in other parts of the world. These are some of the things that I just noted with a few others, but I thought that these are are areas which should have been touched upon only because they indicate optimistic possibilities in the world rather than all the things of bringing us along and so forth and so on. History is doing a lot for us.
Now, if I could respond just quickly, because you raised a number of very important points. In South Africa, the blacks are the majority and the whites are the minority, but the economic power is still in the hands of the white minority. So just because you have a transfer in terms of numbers and demographics doesn't mean they'll necessarily translate into a transfer of economic power. Secondly, I think everybody is impressed with the fact that Barack Obama is going to be the Democratic nominee and potentially the President of the United States. But it's a much more complicated story because he has achieved a level of popularity by transcending race or by not being too black. And so those are issues that we have to deal with in a much more, we could devote a whole session to that alone. And so it still doesn't deal with the level of racism in this country. Even assuming he gets to be president, we still have a race problem and a level of racism that needs to be addressed, even if Barack Obama gets to be president. But you're right, we ought to be optimistic about the future.
What about Asia and China, Bill?
I could take the rest of the afternoon to talk about Asia and China, but we've got some really interesting people coming in the next panel, and they've got a time constraint. But you and I can talk about it.
Josh Peckwood and Jason Dean, since you are also the next generation speaks tomorrow, today you have 1 minute each, and then we will transit. Josh?
Is this on? Is it on? Okay. With the time constraints, I wanted to talk about the dynamics of the middle class and how that functions with race, but I'll skip over that. To go quickly to Mr. Greenberg's point, I thought something interesting is occurring in Brazil right now, and I mentioned the article. Two things. One, they said if the black population, which accounts for nearly half, was incorporated into the economy, it would increase GDP 2%, which is a huge number if you think in terms of GDP and what that could do. Now, if we take that and we look to the United States, unfortunately, we don't have that data here. Why? Because we overlook this problem, and we think it's something that's been solved. So there hasn't been a lot of economic analysis into what would occur if you actually educated blacks to the level of whites and saw what it would do to our GDP. Now, if there is data out there, I'd love to see it. I personally haven't seen it. But I think that's something to look at when we speak about economics, and to maybe phrase it, unfortunately, in the dismal science into a way that maybe will catch the attention of more whites and more capital holders, that this is something that will absolutely benefit them if we were to bring blacks and other minority groups to the educational level. But then this brings us to what Dr. Gale brought up, and that's the issue of fear. And this is the issue of fear that the whites dealt with in South America of losing their economic position. And also the fear of indignation and the fear of resentment that comes along with affirmative action. And I was surprised it hasn't come up in this discussion, But this is something that's very real, particularly amongst white managers and white colleagues that I work at, that oftentimes black colleagues are discredited. If they went to Harvard, they were on some minority scholarship. If they were promoted, we need some color, or they're in their C board, what are they? They're human capital management, or they're on the corporate diversity board, but they're not making the big decisions. And a lot of these issues feed, and they're reciprocal, and they feed back into the stereotypes and feed back into the belief that, yeah, they can work with us, but they're never going to really be on the same level as us. And that's something we really need to think about. And to Dr. Winger, is that correct? To your question about how do we achieve this, and I feel horrible, I can't remember the names, but it was two leaders of the civil rights, and they said that all you need is 10%. You simply need 10% of the population to enact a movement and to create change. You don't need the entire population. So if we can get 10% of the people, 10% of the target population to be engaged, we can in fact create this change.
Dr. Dean.
I'll be very, very quick as well. Even though I'm from Mississippi, I can talk fast. And since I have the microphone, I would like to add my voice to the chorus of gratitude to the Cohens for bringing us together and giving us the space to talk about this. This is clearly a national issue, and we need national leadership. So thank you for that. I work at the Mississippi Economic Council, where we're concerned about increasing per capita income and employment all the time. And I just want to use my time, I guess, to underscore a question that Helene raised, and that is, what are the costs of racism? I think that's such a great question. I think you could potentially make the argument that you could quantify that in some way. I'll just say in Mississippi, we were brought up earlier, our general fund budget is about $5 billion. It's not a lot of money, but 62% of that goes to education. The next 10% goes to social services, and about 5% goes to corrections after that. But when you're talking about $5 billion, that's not a lot of money. So we do have a strong commitment towards education, but I think that we, because of some of the past issues we've dealt with, are still trying to figure out where we can find more money. And that really leads to my next point, and that's, how do you, if you can quantify it, how could you possibly create a qualitative argument around it? And this might be a good book for Doug at some point in the future, but how do you talk about the lost resources? And I have the opportunity to travel around the state all the time in the position that I'm in, and I'm hugely optimistic because those resources are there. And I think conversations like this really put us in a place to have a conversation. And as soon as you get back from West Virginia, I would love to host you in Mississippi so that you could be a part of the conversation there too. We talk about this all the time. Thank you.
Thank you. I accept your invitation. I know your governor, Haley Barbour.
We'd love to have you.
So I look forward to it. I just want to say to my dear friend, Bernard, that as we African Americans talk about our history, when we look back, we're looking back on a dark past, but we're looking brightly to the future, optimistically. And I think we're not interested in overtaking people in numbers. We're just interested in overcoming.
Yeah, but by having numbers, you solve your own problems.
Yes, in a democracy, hopefully. But I think Barack Obama is where he is, not just because of black people. I think he's there because of the good people, because there are not enough black people to put him where he is.
Yeah, but
And Janet, you get the last word.
No, our
got
board
the
member
last
gets the
word. All right.
last word.
Yes. First, will you join me in thanking our presenters and panelists? They did a great job. And here's what we would like to ask everybody to do. For those who are at the central table now, you will be transferring, and those who are coming for the media session, that's session 4 on the back of your name tags, please come forward now. I do want to say that one of our next speakers has written a book saying, "What's My Name, Fool?" And his name is David Zirin, and his schedule is very tight, and we're going to ask David, once we do this transfer, which will take about a minute, to lead off. So if we'll do the table transfer now, and then we'll begin in just 1 minute if everyone can stay where they are otherwise.